In one section of this book, The Art of Beauty, Haweis conflated the idea of women and beauty, and she suggests that should beauty's self find a few useful hints, I see no reason why she should not avail herself of them. And so here she refers to beauty as her. So she's clearly identifying beauty not as an abstract ideal, but as woman. So we can see that she's already overlaid this kind of conflation here. To some extent, she's probably reflecting ideas that were prevalent in society, as I said, by Ruskin and co. But to some extent, she also quotes an English poet called Philip Sidney, who in the 1560s wrote a poem that said something like, which doth every beauty beautify. So again, he kind of conflates that relationship between woman beauty and beauty as an abstract ideal. So that's kind of existing, that's the culture that she's operating within. For design historian Penny Spark, notions of taste and comfort are explored relative to Victorian attitudes towards females as housewives and agents of beauty. Spark notes that beauty was so generally regarded as a fundamental attribute of woman that women were regarded as being, quote, ideally qualified to inject it into the domestic setting. So they took this idea that somehow if women were identified with beauty, then somehow they were just able to kind of disseminate it through society without any education or anything like that. So Spark again points out to that thing. And in this case, beauty was linked with nature through the application of naturalistic imagery and the importation of natural organic objects with the interior. We'll jump through a big section here. Haweis shifted away from writing a fashionable advice book and attempted to impart some principles for ornaments and decorations that might be applicable to the body, dress or interior. The justification being that women as a rule do not know what beauty means and nor do they consider that the fitting and the appropriate have their part in what is really beautiful. So Haweis also observed that in writing her book that although women were identified with this idea of beauty, she understood as a woman that actually we don't really have any educational basis for that position. And again, I think that's a really observant sort of position to have at that period by somebody who was uneducated in a kind of university sense. I've got two slides around the wrong way. Although much of Haweis' writing, there are references to fitness and usefulness in both dress and decorations, but also she sought naturalness and authenticity of the kind espoused by John Ruskin, and here she talks about the naturalness of the line of the body. But for example, she was not only opposed to tight lacing, sort of corsets and things, on health grounds, and she wrote about that quite extensively. She was also against them on aesthetic grounds. And here she has a drawing in her book, which is a gown which she says looks like an ill-shaped wine glass. You can imagine that as a wine glass if you turned it upside down. So she was talking about the problem of the body being constricted and the shape of the dress, and therefore the aesthetic sense of beauty that's kind of impacted by this kind of fashion. Ever conscious of the need for women to display their beauty and dress in environments conducive to appearance, she suggested that there's a reciprocal relationship between the figure and the background. So she thinks there's some relationship between figure and background in terms of beauty. She proposed that when a person's colour did not contrast with the room, they may be lost and wasted, while with different surroundings, her colour may be improved and softened. Certain that surroundings affect appearance and visibility, she argued that there can be no doubt that people look different in different rooms. Moreover, she argued that the importance of decorating our rooms as a background to our figures must also be matched by the person, since, she says, a good background cannot correct ungainly lines about your own person. So she's quite aware that you might look better in a good background, but if you're not that good looking, you better do something about it, you know, to help yourself as well. So she was not adverse to kind of improvements in the body, even if that was done artificially. The imperative was to avoid discordant colours and be harmonious. In an effort to convince, she advised her readers to bring the same care and intelligence to bear upon your dress as your surroundings. So again, that connection is being made. This interrelation between walls as background and between sort of people, dress and furniture was a recurrent theme which she summarised as the walls are a background, not only to furniture but to faces, not only faces but to dresses, and they ought to harmonise with the main pieces of furniture, which themselves become part of and help to modify the background. So she's again quite clear about this relationship between the figure and the space, and the figure again remembering is beauty. So beauty as a figure is projected onto space. So the ideas of beauty of the person and dress is transferred back out into space. Beverly Gordon, in tracing a sort of gendered history of the interior, argues that the 19th century bourgeois interior was one of the few locations available to women's self-expression, an expression that she categorises as the conceptual conflation of women and interiors. Gordon proposes that during this period, the body and interior space were interchangeable, and she gives a few examples where that occurs. For example, in Charles Warner's book, Home Decoration, Warner suggests that have we not often remarked of a house that a room looks just like her? So, and I think another example is Auguste Rodin's sister, who, in coming home in her diary, said something like, my room is so delicious after a day out that it seems to me I'm not myself except when I'm in my room. So again, this identification of the person back within the room. And this is another thing that both Spark and Gordon have noticed, and it's quite clear within Haweis' work that she sees that. And what this preempts is the idea of the personality of the home, that the home is an extension of the self. Haweis theorised that dress is the second self, so dress is the second projection of the self. We're one, dress is a second one. And it bears the same relationship to the body as speech does to the brain. So we could call, she says, we could call dress the speech of the body. Although this was meant in a metaphoric manner, she did attach bells and objects to her own dresses that emitted sounds and that affect the senses and her bodily projection. It's a similar thing to what anthropologist David Howes would call a connection between beautification and exteriorization. So this idea that beautification of the body is exteriorized through sound or visual or art, sort of colour and things like that. Under this conception, we could say that dress was the first outward projection of the body, and it immediately raises a relationship to furniture and surroundings. If we moved out once to dress, we can then move out to furniture and surroundings. Several years later, she restated that the decoration of a room is but a kind of detached dress. Similarly, dress may be properly regarded as furniture of an intimate, special and personal sort. The two must therefore always be considered together. She continued by noting that a painter would not place a subject on an ill-formed piece of furniture, and proposed that a number of women instinctively avoid the chair which clashes with their garments. As if to bind the two together, Haweis views body, dress and furniture, suggesting their possible inseparability and codependence, such that, and she says, a beautiful woman reclining on a sofa becomes for the first time part of the sofa. And the sofa becomes part of her. This notion reinforces Haweis' earlier statement that furniture is a kind of dress, and dress is a kind of furniture, which both mirror the mind of the owner and the temper of the age. On this occasion, she conceptually linked body and mind, the former providing physical identification, the latter individual efforts, such that the rooms must be dressed from the body by a mind that is not blindly following fashion. Having constructed an argument for furniture having a physical and intellectual relationship to the body, Haweis extended the premise into surroundings and suggested that people do not adapt to their walls, but their walls must be adapted to them. That is, rooms were decorated as an outward projection of self and are returned in a form of doubling. And she says, by carefully decorating our rooms as a background to our figures. And I think we could understand this as a kind of a mirroring of the body. And when we say body, we also mean beauty. So this kind of mirroring occurs. Or we could understand it, say, as a projection of the domestic body into the environment, in which the surroundings become an extension of the self. And kind of to sort of summarise or conclude this, I would say that the relationship between the body and dress and the projection of the self into the surroundings was certainly anticipated in both books, The Art of Beauty and The Art of Decoration, where there's a series of statements that tease out a relationship between the body, dress and surroundings. Beginning with the body, or rather the female body as the site of beauty, clothes were regarded as a projection of the self, and furniture as the next level of projection. Again, in a form of mirroring of the self, so this idea of this sort of thing building out. When we get then to surroundings, surroundings including the coloration and decoration of walls, Haweis argued they must be regarded as an accessory to the main object, which is the individual. So we start to see an idea that the surrounding, the surfaces, the walls of the space are now regarded as an accessory to the object, the accessory to the self. So this projection outwards starts to claim architecture's relationship to the body in a very clear and very kind of strong sort of philosophical manner. For Mary Haweis, walls were intended to be a background or setting for people and should be decorated to work best with the occupant in a manner that identifies them with room. So again here, she's opening for the first time a very clear link between the psychology of space and which is the person and the space, so this identification of personality with the space. And this is done in advance of people like Emily Post and Elsie de Wolfe, who talked about the personality of the home. The proposition regarding the decorative interior as an extension of the inhabiting body, which in this case is female, I don't know, I lost a sentence there. The body was made spatial by extending its influence on clothes, furniture and wall coverings. The implication of these observations on domestic ornamentation is that woman's body is projected out, moulded onto the returning surface, which is now redescribed as an enclosing and enveloping volume. We could say it is both the setting and the set for inhabitation. Thank you. That's fine.
I wasn't announced. I'm kind of an intruder to this one. The name's up there and the presentation is here, but unfortunately my work week begins on a Sunday, so I have to head back and be back at work. So I'll be leaving tomorrow and I can't present during my scheduled time, so I'm going to do it now. I've been trying to figure out as I sit there how I can fit into this theme, and the only thing I could come up with is thinking, as Mark was talking about, women potentially having the innate knowledge of beauty. I'm kind of at an advantage in that where I teach, the student body is about 85% female, so we must be teaching the best architects in the world because it's innately the beauty and the knowledge. This thing is moving forward on its own, I don't know why. So I'll try to fight it the whole time, but it's going to be a good fight.
That's
Do I?
it will be changed automatically.
Yeah, how do I stop that?
Like this. If you use like this, that's not a problem.
Oh, use it like this. Okay, so it won't be as pretty.
Could you tell us a little more about who you are and where you teach?
Yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm trying to stall while everything gets pulled up. My name's Kevin Sweet. I teach at the American University of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. I'm a beginning design professor, also an architect. So I teach in, it's an emirate right outside of Dubai. It's one of the 7 emirates, so nobody really knows what Sharjah is, so I usually tell them I'm from Dubai. It's our neighboring emirate, and everybody knows, most everybody knows what Dubai is. So I teach a 2nd year architectural studio, and this paper is about some of the theories and philosophies that we use in teaching that and some of the outcomes from it. We used, in this case, a historical part of Dubai, the only historical part of Dubai that exists. Really not quite as historical as you might imagine. I'll get to some of the background as I move through it. I'm going to try to keep this under 15 minutes. So I'll go through it as I move through the document. Everybody's fairly familiar with the skylines of Dubai and how fast it's come up. It's often shocking, even for me, having lived there for 8 years, to see the difference between an image from the 1960s and an image of today, which is an incredible growth of a city. So you can imagine that a city that grows this fast, especially adopting sort of Western architects and Western ideologies in order to get this growth, has sort of maybe an identity problem or a crisis, maybe. So what I'm going to look at is how, as I teach students in this region, how we begin to address that or try to incorporate that in some of the philosophies of teaching. Part of our other problem, besides having a very diverse student body, is most of them are expatriates, meaning most of them are not actual national citizens of the country. Maybe 10% of our student body are Emirati. The rest are expatriates that have been born and raised in the country, so it's not that they know any other way or any other culture. They've been raised in the country and are familiar with their surroundings. So there's kind of this weird architectural mix in knowledge in that their association with architecture is what they see around them in Dubai and what they grow up with. So historically, the UAE, the UAE nationals are very nomadic people, and even as far back as a single generation ago, I have students whose grandparents remember living in, these are called Arish houses. They're very temporary houses made out of palm fronds, and they're used to allow breezes to come through and light, but fight off the desert heat. And that was only, those houses existed easily within this photograph. It's very rare that the housing was actually permanent. Today the housing is much different. The local housing, I call them mini palaces. Most of them like to live, most of my students live in houses similar to this, so they're raised in these houses, and this is their understanding of domesticity and understanding of housing and sort of a mini palace condition. And this is pretty typical of the region, which really likes to rely on the nostalgia, the tales of the Knights of the Arabian, all of these things to kind of produce this nostalgic wonderland, or fantasy if you want, of life there. The reality of the history, and these are images of the only historical neighborhood in Dubai, it's called the ARCHTHEO. It was actually established as permanent housing by Iranians who had moved in. So even the history of their history is not really their history. So it's a very difficult juxtaposition of cultures and identities, and trying to talk to students that are not from the region about history of the region and about adopting philosophies of architecture, a few of them of which I'll talk about as I move through the presentation. So the topics I'm going to talk about that we introduce in this beginning design studio are fairly basic topics. We don't go into depth in these. These are, again, it's the first encounter with an architectural studio, and we introduce them to these theories and philosophies, but don't necessarily go completely in depth into them. So the ones I'll talk about as I move through the paper is historicism, critical regionalism, as coined by Kenneth Frampton, and phenomenology, which I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go through and get to the phenomenology part. So what I've done is here I'm kind of juxtaposing the historic Dubai. This is on the right, the Bastakia. This is an actual historical housing which was established around 1920. So the history is no more than 100 years old, or a little bit less than 100 years old. And then the perceived historical, or the nostalgia of what I would call the historicism that's actually used in building resorts and interpretations of what old Arabia actually looked like. So on the right is an actual functioning wind tower, and on the left are just decorative wind towers used in a resort. This is a restaurant in one of the beach resorts with just the wind tower as an entryway. So all of it just being sort of used or adopted as a facade, almost like a Disneyland facade. Same thing here, historical Bastakia, with juxtaposed to another resort where these are villas that you can rent and stay, where they've even dug canals to put up this desert housing in a non-desert type condition. So this is the architecture that the students are exposed to, that they see growing up. So it's a difficult task teaching beginning design students to really be critical about what they see and understand what they see and understand the context of it, which is why we introduced the idea of historicism. Not to use it as a design philosophy, but to use it as a way to understand how some of the current architecture that there exists and why it possibly exists. We move more into the idea of critical regionalism, where we use the Bastakia housing as sort of a vehicle that takes us into some of the positive parts of historical housing, and then how do we take that positive and contemporize it and use it in a modern design philosophy. So the project that we did was in the middle of the historic housing, and you can see it's all very heavy courtyard housing. Their project, this gray portion here, was an infill of one of these conditions. So they were to take, we were imagining one of the houses being demolished in typical Dubai style, because nothing can last for more than 20 years anyway. So we would demolish it and allow them to design a contemporary house that could and should fit into the context that surrounds it. So these are existing courtyard conditions. All of this historical housing has been redone. This is not its original condition. It's been remodeled and redone so that tourists can experience history of Dubai through a reimagined condition. They're all art galleries now. There is no residence there, but they were initially residences of very well-to-do trading people. So this is the existing courtyard conditions. It's one of the conditions we asked the students to bring into their project, and so it was a required part of it. And these are their responses of their courtyard condition after examining the existing courtyard conditions themselves. So along with the courtyards, these are a few more. These are just various, they're kind of random students that I pulled out to see how they're addressing the courtyard conditions and even addressing these transition zones between the courtyard depending on sun angles. And again, these are beginning design students, so these shouldn't look like these very glossy images that you might see from star architects or anybody else. This is their second semester, and we're using many tools, including philosophy, digital tools, to try and reinforce these philosophies, these theories, including and especially using the tools toward phenomenology. And it's easy to kind of list these three things as categories that we go through and try and check off, but it's not that easy to talk about them that way because they're so interconnected. The idea of critical regionalism and phenomenology are interdependent on each other because as you examine the history of the architecture there, you want to bring in some of the ideas of the phenomenology that are part of the existing conditions, and part of that being courtyards, which I'm showing here, and the effect of light and the materials used in courtyards, the materials used in building, examining the existing neighborhood and existing conditions to show how close the corridors are to provide shading. In case you don't know, in the summers, Dubai will get up to 50 degrees Celsius, which is close to 120 Fahrenheit. So it's very warm, and this is prior to the time of air conditioning. So even, you know, a 10-degree difference in temperature was huge. And the wind towers historically would give you 10 to 15 degree temperature change, which is why you see them in the contemporary or the historic housing. So taking upon this idea of close-knit passageways and shaded passageways, the students also began to employ those in their own designs. So in their own site, entryways were seen as close spaces that provided shade. They provided entry conditions or sequencing into the projects that capitalized on the shading condition. The entire design process was sort of run this way. It was a new process for me. I've been teaching for 8 years, and it's very easy to teach a second-year studio as a studio about form and space, and thinking simple and volumetrically, and thinking through plan and section. But this one I ran quite differently. We ran it through the idea of the perspective and kind of stitching perspective together, using modern tools and modern digital tools and rendering tools that now are much faster, much easier, use real-world physics so they can get real-world lighting conditions without much effort, real-world textures without much effort,